This happened just last fall, and I still get chills thinking about it. My name is Lauren Hayes, and I love solo hiking. There's something peaceful about being alone in the wilderness, away from the noise of everyday life. That day, I had planned a short trek up to a nearby hill, a route I had researched thoroughly. It was supposed to be simple, just a few hours in and out, enough to enjoy the crisp autumn air before heading back to my car at the small parking lot near the trailhead. I had packed light, just a water bottle, a granola bar, and my phone. The sun was high when I started, filtering through the golden leaves, the forest alive with the rustling of birds and distant creaks of tree branches. It felt safe, peaceful. But looking back, I realized now that I wasn't alone. I was making good time, my boots crunching against the damp earth as I followed the winding path upward. The air smelled of pine and rich soil, the kind of scent that made me feel at home in the wild. About an hour into my hike, as I rounded a bend near a small clearing, I saw him, a man standing in the middle of the trail. He was dressed like a seasoned hiker, wearing a heavy backpack and sturdy boots, as if he was prepared for a long journey. He smiled when he saw me, a little too eager, and asked if I was heading to the summit. I told him no, that I was only going to the hill and would be back before evening. That's when he suggested I join him for a 3-day hike to the mountain peak. I laughed politely, shaking my head. "No, I didn't pack for that," I said, keeping my tone light. But something about him put me on edge. The way he kept staring, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I stepped past him, hoping that would be the end of it, but after a few minutes I heard footsteps behind me. At first I thought he was just going the same way, but when I quickened my pace, so did he. My heart started to beat faster. I glanced back, and there he was, keeping a steady distance, his expression unreadable. Maybe I was overreacting, but something about the way he trailed behind me sent a cold shiver up my spine. I considered stopping to let him pass, but my gut told me not to. Instead, I kept moving, trying to stay calm. The forest was dense here, the trees towering overhead, blocking most of the light. The path twisted ahead, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. I just needed to keep going, get back to the main route, and I'd be fine. The trail narrowed as I pushed forward, my breathing steady but tense. The sound of his footsteps never faded, always keeping pace just far enough behind to make it clear he was following me. My pulse pounded in my ears. I debated confronting him, demanding to know why he wouldn't leave me alone, but fear kept me moving. I needed to get back to the main route. There would be other hikers there, safety in numbers. The problem was, I had taken a side path to get a better view of the valley below, and now I wasn't sure how far I had strayed from the more traveled trails. I stole another glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. He wasn't just walking anymore. He had picked up his pace, his long strides closing the distance between us. Panic flared in my chest, and without thinking, I broke into a run. Branches whipped against my arms as I sprinted down the uneven trail, my boots kicking up dirt and fallen leaves. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him, his heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth, gaining on me. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I had no idea where I was going anymore. The trail twisting unpredictably, the thick canopy above swallowing the last traces of daylight. Then, through the trees, I spotted something. A dark structure barely visible between the tangled branches. An old cabin. I veered toward it without hesitation, my only thought to hide, to lose him somehow. The door was slightly ajar, its wooden frame warped with age. I slipped inside, pressing my back against the wall, forcing myself to slow my breathing. Outside, the footsteps came to a halt. He was close, too close. I clamped a hand over my mouth as silence filled the space around me. Then slowly, the creaking of the cabin's rotting porch steps. And sure enough, he was here. The floorboards groaned softly beneath my weight as I shifted, pressing myself deeper into the shadows of the cabin. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Through a gap in the wooden planks, I saw his silhouette moving outside, his head turning as he scanned the trees. I held my breath, barely daring to blink. Then, slowly, he stepped onto the porch. The old wood creaked beneath his boots, each step deliberate, unhurried. He knew I was here. The door shuddered as he pushed it open wider, the dim light filtering through the trees, casting his long shadow across the floor. I shrank back, willing myself to disappear into the darkness. The stale air of the abandoned cabin pressed around me as he took another step inside. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind outside, and then his voice, soft, almost amused. "I know you're in here." I swallowed the rising panic, my hands gripping the rough wooden wall behind me. My mind raced. If I stayed hidden, would he give up and leave? Or would he search every inch of the cabin until he found me? The dim light barely reached my corner, but I could see the outline of his boots as he moved deeper inside. He was methodical, stepping carefully, his breath slow and measured. I pressed myself lower, biting my lip to keep from making a sound. Then, another creak. He turned sharply toward my hiding spot, and for a terrifying second, I thought it was over. But before he could take another step, a distant noise echoed through the trees, a branch snapping, something moving beyond the cabin. He froze, listening. My pulse pounded in my ears as he hesitated, then turned back toward the doorway. After a long, agonizing moment, he stepped outside. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Through a crack in the wooden wall, I could see him standing just outside the cabin, his head slowly turning as he scanned the trees. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual rustling of wildlife absent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. My legs ached from crouching, but I didn't dare move. Then he did something that sent a chill down my spine. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a long hunting knife. The blade caught the faint light filtering through the trees, glinting like a promise of violence. My stomach twisted. He wasn't just following me, he was hunting me. He took a step toward the tree line, his posture tense, as if expecting something, or someone, to be there. This was my chance. Forcing my limbs to obey, I inched toward the opposite side of the cabin, where a broken window offered a possible escape. If I moved fast enough, I could slip out and disappear into the woods before he noticed. But one mistake, one sound, and I knew I wouldn't get another chance. Carefully, I slipped through the broken window, biting my lip as a jagged piece of wood scraped against my arm. The moment my feet touched the ground outside, I crouched low, pressing myself against the cabin wall. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I needed to move, but every step risked making a sound. Slowly, I crept toward the dense tree line, my breath shallow, ears straining for any sign that he had noticed me. A twig snapped beneath my boot, and I froze. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving straight toward where I had just been. My stomach lurched. He knew. I broke into a sprint, weaving between the trees as fast as I could. Branches tore at my clothes, the forest floor uneven beneath my feet, but I couldn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. His footsteps were right behind me, crashing through the underbrush, faster, closer. My lungs burned as panic fueled my strides. I had to lose him. I had to find somewhere to hide. I pushed myself harder, dodging low branches and leaping over fallen logs. But no matter how fast I ran, he was still behind me. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, and the weight of exhaustion began to creep in. Then, up ahead, the terrain sloped downward, leading to a narrow ravine. The path was treacherous, lined with loose rocks and tangled roots, but I had no choice. I plunged forward, my boots skidding on the dirt as I fought to stay upright. Behind me, the man's footsteps grew erratic, his heavy breathing mixing with the rustling of disturbed foliage. I risked a glance over my shoulder just as he stumbled, his foot catching on a root. His arms flailed, his body pitching forward, then suddenly he was gone. A sickening thud echoed through the trees, followed by silence. My chest heaved as I stared at the empty space where he had been. Cautiously, I inched closer, peering over the edge of the ravine. Below, his body lay motionless among the jagged rocks. My stomach churned. I didn't wait to see if he was still alive. I turned and ran. Without thinking, I returned to the climbing route to descend the hill as quickly as possible. The journey felt long, maybe because I was haunted by guilt for causing all this. But my sane mind dismissed it immediately, remembering the bad possibilities that would happen if he managed to catch me. Dawn was beginning to break, casting a pale, silvery light through the trees. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to keep going, stumbling over uneven ground as I made my way back toward the trail. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me, but when I glanced back, the forest was empty. The man was gone. Whether dead or alive, I didn't know, and I didn't care. All I could focus on was reaching the climbing post. My breath was ragged, my hands scratched and trembling, but when I finally saw the familiar sign marking the entrance to the trail, relief crashed over me like a wave. I staggered forward, my eyes stinging with exhaustion, and then, there it was, my car, sitting untouched in the empty parking lot, bathed in the soft glow of morning light. With the last of my strength, I ran to my car, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands. My fingers barely worked, stiff with exhaustion and cold, but after what felt like an eternity, I managed to unlock the door and throw myself inside. Slamming the lock down, I gripped the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see him stumble out of the woods, but the forest remained still, untouched by the nightmare I had just survived. As the engine roared to life, a wave of relief crashed over me, but I didn't dare linger. I tore out of the parking lot, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the winding road, leaving the cursed forest far behind. The morning sun rose higher, burning away the horrors of the night. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never hike alone again. A month had passed, and life had slowly returned to normal. The fear that once gripped me had faded into a distant memory, buried beneath the routine of everyday life. I told myself it was over. The forest, the chase, the sheer terror, I had survived, and that was all that mattered. I barely even thought about it anymore. But one evening, as I sat on my couch scrolling through the news on my laptop, a headline stopped me cold. Body found at the bottom of a cliff in Blackwood Forest. My stomach lurched. My breath hitched in my throat. With a trembling hand, I clicked the article. The report was brief. Hikers had discovered the remains of a man at the base of a steep drop, his body likely there for weeks. No signs of foul play, no identification released. But I didn't need a name. I knew exactly who it was. My blood ran ice cold as I stared at the screen, my mind racing back to that night. I had almost forgotten, almost. But now, the fear was back. And this time, it wasn't going away. This happened back in 2012 when I was 22. I had just moved to Phoenix, Arizona for a new job, a low-paying but decent gig at an auto repair shop. The hours were long, and I didn't know many people in the city yet. So on weekends, I often took long drives into the desert just to clear my head. That night, I had been driving for hours, the empty highway stretching endlessly in both directions. There were no other cars, no streetlights, just the occasional glow of distant gas stations. I was about halfway through my drive back to Phoenix when I first saw it, a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror appearing out of nowhere on the desolate road behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another late-night traveler. But then, the car started gaining on me. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the car behind me, but something felt off. It was moving too fast, closing the distance between us unnaturally quickly. I was already going 10 over the speed limit, yet within moments, its headlights were glaring in my rearview mirror, nearly blinding me. I could barely make out the shape of the vehicle. An old, dark sedan, its make and model unrecognizable in the dim light. It didn't try to pass me. It just stayed there, tailgating so closely that if I so much as tapped my brakes, it would have slammed right into me. A chill ran down my spine. There was no reason for a car to be this aggressive on an empty highway in the middle of the desert. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. I flicked my turn signal and moved into the other lane, hoping the car would pass, but it didn't. Instead, it mirrored my movement, staying right behind me. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just some impatient driver. Whoever was in that car was deliberately keeping pace with me. I pressed the gas, pushing my speed higher, but the car matched me, its headlights glaring in my mirrors. My hands were slick against the steering wheel. There was nothing around for miles, just the open desert, the endless stretch of highway, and the faint glow of a distant diner sign barely visible against the horizon. I didn't know who was in that car or what they wanted, but I knew one thing: I had to get to that diner. I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, watching those headlights follow me like a predator stalking its prey. The road stretched on endlessly, an unforgiving ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren desert. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter as I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, just another driver heading in the same direction. But the longer I watched, the harder that was to believe. I slowed down slightly, just enough to see if the car behind me would pass. It didn't. Instead, it adjusted to my speed perfectly, keeping the exact same distance. My pulse quickened. This wasn't normal. This wasn't random. Whoever was back there was watching me, following me, waiting. I pressed down on the gas, trying to put some distance between us, but the headlights remained, unwavering, unshaken. My fuel gauge edged closer to empty, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something up ahead, a faint flickering neon sign against the darkness. A diner, the only sign of civilization for miles. It was my only chance. I didn't hesitate. I veered toward the diner's gravel lot, my tires kicking up dust as I pulled in fast, my heart hammering against my ribs. The old building sat isolated, a relic from another time, its neon sign barely clinging to life as it buzzed weakly in the night. A few trucks were parked outside, their hulking shapes casting long shadows under the dim parking lot lights. I killed the engine and glanced in my mirror just in time to see the car that had been following me slow down on the highway. It didn't turn in, it didn't drive past, it just stopped. Its headlights blazed through the darkness, aimed directly at me. I couldn't see who was inside, but I could feel them watching. My skin prickled. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us moved. Then the driver cut the headlights, plunging the car into darkness. The road was empty. The night was silent, but I knew, whoever they were still there, and they were waiting. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wasn't safe yet, but I had a choice. Stay in the car, vulnerable and alone, or get inside the diner where there were people. Swallowing my fear, I grabbed my keys and stepped out, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air was dry and still, the distant hum of cicadas the only sound. I kept my head down as I hurried toward the entrance, feeling exposed under the flickering neon glow. My fingers trembled as I pushed open the heavy door, a bell jingling above me. The moment I stepped inside, the warm, greasy scent of diner food filled my nose, along with the low murmur of voices. A few truckers sat at the counter, hunched over their meals, while an older waitress wiped down a table in the corner. It was a picture of normalcy, a stark contrast to the fear clawing at my chest. But as I turned to glance out the window, my stomach dropped. The car was still there, parked just off the highway, barely visible in the darkness. And then, slowly, deliberately, the driver's side door began to open. I ducked into the nearest booth, my pulse pounding in my ears. The vinyl seat was cold against my back as I pressed myself into the corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. My breath was shallow, my fingers gripping the edge of the table. Through the wide front window, I watched the car sit in the darkness, its engine still running. The door had opened, but whoever was inside hadn't stepped out yet. The truckers at the counter kept eating, oblivious to the growing dread twisting in my gut. The waitress gave me a tired glance, then went back to wiping down the counter. To them, I was just another weary traveler stopping in for coffee. But I wasn't. I was being hunted, and if they stepped inside, I had nowhere to run. The bell over the door jingled. My body tensed as a gust of cool night air swept into the diner. I didn't dare look up right away. I kept my eyes on the chipped Formica tabletop, my fingers curled into fists in my lap. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moved across the diner floor. The truckers didn't react. The waitress barely glanced up. Whoever had been in that car was inside now, standing just feet away. I forced myself to lift my gaze, just enough to see without being obvious. A man in a dark jacket stood near the entrance, his hands buried in his pockets. His face was shadowed under the brim of a cap, but I could feel his gaze sweeping the diner, searching, looking for me. My pulse hammered against my ribs. If he saw me, if he was sure I was the one he'd been following, what would he do? I kept my head down, willing myself to be invisible. The man took a slow step forward, then another. He wasn't in a hurry. He was confident, like he knew he had all the time in the world. I could hear the soft creak of leather as he adjusted his stance, the faint clink of something metal in his pocket. A knife? A key? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. The waitress finally looked up. "Help you, hon?" she asked, her voice tired. The man didn't answer right away. I could feel him scanning the room, and I resisted the urge to sit in my seat. "Just coffee," he said after a long pause, his voice even, almost too calm. He moved toward the counter and sat down, but he didn't take off his cap. My gut twisted. He was waiting, watching. He knew I was here. And he wasn't leaving until I did. He could see me through it. I needed a plan. My eyes darted to the back of the diner, a door marked "Employees Only." If it led outside, I might have a chance. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky beneath me. The man didn't react, but I knew he was aware of my every move. I walked casually toward the back, pretending like I belonged, like I was just another tired traveler stretching his legs. My fingers brushed against the door handle. It was locked. My stomach dropped. Before I could think, I heard the scrape of a chair against the floor. The man was getting up. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. If I ran now, I'd only confirm that I knew what was happening. I needed another way out. My eyes flicked toward the kitchen, where a cook in a stained apron flipped burgers on a greasy grill. My legs burned as I pushed forward, my eyes darting across the empty landscape for any sign of salvation. Then up ahead, I saw it, a truck, engine rumbling, its driver climbing into the cab. Desperation fueled me. I bolted toward it, waving frantically. "Hey, please wait!" The driver, a burly man in a faded cap, hesitated for a split second before I yanked open the passenger door and scrambled inside. "Drive, please, just go!" I slammed the door shut, my pulse pounding in my ears. He didn't ask questions. One look at my face and he threw the truck into gear, roaring onto the highway. As we sped off, I dared to glance out the window. The diner shrank behind us, its fluorescent lights humming against the dark. Near the back, a shadowy figure stood still, watching. I didn't know who he was or why he had chased me. I only knew that I was safe now. The desert stretched endlessly before us, the nightmare finally over.